Hey guys, Greg here. Musical question for you. What is the most overrated album in jazz? The most overrated album in jazz history. I'm going to bring the receipts and show you exactly why I believe this to be true and why it's important. You know, there's a lot of these top 10, top 20 lists that are mostly BS, let's be honest. You know, Apple just came out with their top 100 list. Most people are annoyed by it. It only has 3 jazz albums on it. Greatest albums of all time, blah, blah, blah. While the lists themselves are kind of stupid, the fact that this one album keeps getting overrated is a problem for jazz and for the culture. I will tell you why, and I'll explain. But let me just give you a little disclaimer. When I say something is overrated, doesn't mean it's not a good album, doesn't mean it's not a great album, doesn't mean the musicians aren't wonderful. The album I'm going to show you, most of you are going to be mad when I say this, but it's reality. But when I say it's overrated, that means the people who did the rating did a poor job of rating it. Doesn't mean that musicians didn't do a great job. So, in doing some research for this little video, I picked up my iPhone. I did a lot of research, but 2 days ago I said, you know, Siri, give me a list of the top 10 greatest jazz albums of all time. Okay, because Apple, you know, everyone trusts Apple because Apple's the largest corporation in the world. They must be trustworthy. It took me right to a website called jazz.org. That sounds pretty authoritative, jazz.org. It turns out that is the website of Live at Lincoln Center. Live at Lincoln Center, very prestigious, but sort of in the old line jazz tradition, you know, Wynton Marsalis, and it's in D.C. Presidents are always there giving out awards or accepting awards, or according to the internet, that's an authoritative source. Get to the punchline, Greg. All right, here it is. The #1 album, drum roll. There it is, okay? Is that what you were expecting? Were you expecting Brubeck's Time Out? Great album. Everyone loves this album. I like it. Maybe I love it. I got 3 copies, okay? Including the original cover before they mutilated the artwork. Mutilated artwork, real artwork. Why is this album overrated? Well, jazz is Black America's art form, and on #1 on our list is a white guy. He and Paul Desmond. They have one black guy in the band, but it's a white jazz album. To me, that's disrespectful, and their top 10 list didn't even have any Miles Davis on it. Maybe that's the feud between Wynton Marsalis and Miles. I don't know. I looked at a lot of other sources. Google gave me as the top hit was UMG, Universal Music Group. You Discover Music, the largest record company on the planet. They basically own everything except for Columbia, Sony, and Warner Brothers. Their top 100 list was Miles Kinda Blue, #1. #2, Coltrane, Love Supreme. Can't really argue with those. And #3, Brubeck, Time Out. A lot of lists that you will look at out there will give Brubeck somewhere in the top 5. 3 is pretty common. And I'm here to prove to you why that is an overrating. It shouldn't be up in the top 3 or 4. Maybe it should be in the top 20 or 30, but it is distorting the history of jazz, and it's denigrating the culture by putting it at #1 or 2 or 3. One reason is that this album is outside of the traditions of jazz. Jazz, a black art form. This record came out of a U.S. State Department propaganda mission, and it's a white guy who is steeped in the traditions of classical music. The #2 song in here, Blue Rondo a la Turk, is a callback to a Mozart sonata. It's a play on words of a Mozart sonata. So, black music tradition, blues, Dixieland jazz, and then you got this white tradition of, oh, we're smarter because we went to school and we studied in a conservatory. The other reasons why this record is too high on the list that's a problem for me is because it commits an error of omission. For most Americans, they can't really name too many jazz musicians. If you ask the average 100 Americans, they would say, oh yeah, I've heard of Dave Brubeck, I've heard of Miles Davis, I've heard of Duke Ellington, but they haven't heard of Wayne Shorter, and they haven't heard of Charles Mingus, and they haven't heard of Horace Silver, Art Blakey. I'm not talking about the average music fan. I'm talking about the average person walking down the street. It was Dave Brubeck in 1954 who was on the cover of Time magazine. Louis Armstrong was on, and then a while later Brubeck. Only two Americans, as far as I know, who've had that honor. That distorts Americans' perception of who are the greats in jazz. And Brubeck literally said to Duke Ellington, "It should have been you." Brubeck literally had some white guilt about being on the cover of Time magazine, and Duke Ellington wasn't. Duke Ellington, greatest composer in the history of jazz. Before this record is the product of U.S. State Department propaganda. Sort of an accidental product, if you will, but nevertheless, this record wouldn't have happened, wouldn't come into existence if the State Department wasn't trying to use jazz as a propaganda weapon against the Soviets. This topic is covered in a documentary called The Jazz Ambassadors, if you haven't seen that. Basically, 1950s U.S. Cold War. United States, wonderful, freedom, Russia, evil, communist, Soviets. Russia and China are going to destroy the world because they're evil. Well, maybe they are evil. That's a different topic. But the United States had an image problem because every time the United States said, "Hey, we're the country of freedom and equality," the Russians would be like, "Yeah, you got a black problem. You got no civil rights. You got people beating the crap out of blacks. You got blacks that can't vote in some states. You got racism. You got separate drinking fountains, separate restaurants, separate clubs." Brubeck could not get his band in to play certain venues because he had a black bass player. Anyway, the U.S. State Department's, one of their ideas to combat this is to say, "Hey, we're going to send our most famous jazz musicians over behind the Iron Curtain, and they're going to do all these concerts and spread the goodwill and love of American black music all over the land, and that's going to be a great propaganda image win for the United States." And they sent Dizzy Gillespie, Ellington, Louis Armstrong, of course, Dave Brubeck, Benny Goodman. And I was like, "Hey, Ebony and Ivory, we're all together in perfect harmony." And Brubeck had an integrated band at that time. He had a black bass player. You know, he made his career in playing in colleges. That was one of the big, he was one of maybe the first musicians to spend a lot of time going from college to college. And he literally had, Southern colleges that would say, "You know what, we got a contract with you. We just found out you got a black bass player, so you ain't playing at our college." So that was a point of controversy. And there is also controversy about how Brubeck handled it, because occasionally he would just cancel the concert without an explanation, without coming forward and saying, "The reason I'm canceling this concert is because they won't let my black bass player on stage." So he's got some criticism for not being vocal enough about that. And there's a really good article on this topic that I'm going to post and show you guys. And I use some of that in the research for this video. The point I'm making is that this album came out of a U.S. State Department project. It did not come out of the brains of the musicians themselves. But when they were visiting overseas, they got to hear and be exposed to music of other cultures, specifically the country of Turkey, where they heard this Turkish folk music, and they got really into the weird time signatures of the Turkish musicians. And that's where the weird time signature thing came from. Take 5 is in 5/4, and Blue Rondo a la Turk is in 9/8, and there's a couple other weird time signature things here. So those things did not come from the jazz tradition of blues. They came from, hey, we found some music in another country that we want to integrate into jazz. Take 5 is in 5/4, but these Turkish rhythms are really breaking it up into groups of 2s and 3s. So Blue Rondo a la Turk is 9/8, but it's really 2-2-2-3. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, 1-2-3, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, 1-2-3, da-da-da-da-da-da, 1-2-3. Take 5, Blue Rondo a la Turk. The most two famous songs on there came out of Turkish rhythms, but also a nod to Mozart. This record, kind of outside of the mainstream of black American jazz. So ironically, at the end of the tour, coming back to the U.S., Paul Desmond especially, had all these ideas in his head for this cool record about Turkish rhythms. But the record company, Columbia, said, "Well, yeah, whatever, Turkish rhythms. We need you to make a big selling jazz record for. So when you get back to the States, we want you to do a record called Gone with the Wind. And that's going to be about Southern themes. So it's like we're doing this thing to promote racial unity, and you're giving us Gone with the Wind as the next record we got to make, which is about post-Civil War South and the rich plantation owners whose lives were being disrupted by this nasty Civil War. That's really the record you're going to come back to the U.S. and make. And the record itself has all these goofy minstrel songs, literally songs written for minstrels in the 1800s and early 1900s. White guys writing songs for black minstrels. What kind of ridiculous. You guys got to make a record about the South. Make a bunch of minstrel songs. And they came back and said, well, yeah, if we got any studio time left, we want to make this record about Turkish rhythms. And that turned out to be the biggest selling jazz record of all time, or one of the top. Okay, another reason why Time Out, great record, but not the number 1 or 2 or 3 record of all time. Another reason why it is overrated is because it is outside of the traditions of American black jazz, but it also was kind of a cultural dead end. Okay, when you look at how influential Kind of Blue is, or modal music became huge and still is huge in jazz anyway. Modal music is huge since that record came out, and after Love Supreme came out, spiritual jazz and free jazz and avant-garde jazz, huge and continue to be huge. But after Brubeck came out with Time Out, how many people suddenly said, I want to do records with Turkish rhythms. I want to do odd time signatures and Turkish rhythms mixed with classical. Nobody did that except Brubeck did a few. For all these reasons, it overemphasizes the classical tradition in jazz that de-emphasizes the black folk and blues traditions in jazz. And it was a cultural dead end because it didn't really influence anybody to go make records like this. Now, Brubeck himself and Desmond were influential in that the West Coast jazz movement was huge. The kind of softer, mellower tunes. Brubeck and Desmond were certainly major proponents and influencers in that area, but not so much this particular album. The contributions of this album with the Turkish time signatures, that just didn't turn into a movement in jazz. Okay guys, I hope I haven't beaten this thing to death, but I probably have, like I do. I understand a lot of you are going to be really upset because he's criticizing Dave Brubeck. He's criticizing my favorite jazz record, Time Out. No, at no time in this video do I criticize Brubeck. It is a great record. You should buy it, you should listen to it, and it certainly deserves to be in the top 25 or top 50 jazz records of all time. But the people who said it is the number 1 or 2 or 3 record of all time have overrated it. So it is an overrated record. Thanks for bearing with me in this long-winded video. And I do want to hear your comments. What other records are overrated? Maybe my channel is overrated. Maybe YouTube is overrated. Maybe vinyl is overrated. I don't know. Thanks for watching. I'm hitting the off button.